And we're back to the shit show of French politics. Second part, talking about Front National, about the extreme right.
Yeah, such a happy topic this week.
Absolutely.
All right, so in the first part, we discussed a lot about the Front National, how it evolved ideologically, a bit how it encroached in the French political landscape. But what I would like to discuss a bit more in the second part is the specific histories of French racism, and especially right now how it fits into the wider global conversation. I think that's something you were interested in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the couple of so again, French racism has a lot of similarities with what you would find abroad. Especially something very prominent is how it translated from biological racism, which still exists, but has been a bit debunked by science, and now it's much more the conversation about cultural issues. In that it's not a problem of biology, or it's not stated outright, more implied, but but different culture that cannot integrate. We need to...
Biological racism, you mean eugenics and
Yes.
all these different theories or sciences, fake sciences that were part of the discourse in the until the early 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century, unfortunately,
Exactly.
on how the different races, were somewhat handicapped compared to the white Caucasian race.
Yeah, exactly, and you still have it, especially in intelligence measure tests, and how different ethnic groups don't have the same IQs. But I feel like that most of the discourse has strayed from strictly eugenic perspective, because again, World War II came through, and debunking of this pseudoscience came through. And now I feel like the discourse is much more about culture, with the idea that some cultures really cannot live together, cannot mix, and that's the whole gist of the white ethno-nationalists. They're saying that the white culture is specific and needs to have its own space, and should not be mixed or overtaken by foreign cultures.
Before we leave the eugenics behind, or before we park the eugenics, one of the things that I've heard or read, I don't remember, about eugenics was that it was a genuine science, in the sense that it was understood, or the proponents, or many of the proponents of it, were approaching it as if it was a genuine science, and they were trying what, let's say, the cultural trappings that led to that also were that, of course, since we're in an imperialist white savior culture, and that's the narrative and the rationale that we've articulated to justify the use of force to colonize and to bring our empire in a way that it doesn't feel so just unfair exploitation, then we need to build also, or from that baseline, we try to understand why are they underdeveloped, why are they underprivileged, and why they have less cognitive capacities than the colonizers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is not really our subject, and not one I'm a specialist about, but what is now called scientific racism was very much, I would say, is still very much a thing, with the idea that there are innate biological differences, intelligence differences, and that this is why different ethnic population cannot really cohabitate, and especially shouldn't mix with the white supremacy angle. That is definitely a thing. If you really want to be depressed, I suggest reading a bit into it. But again, it's it's a bit of a huge
Yes,
subject.
sorry. I remember it was. I remember when we went to the Berlin Museum of History. I think that's where I learned that the interracial marriage was not banned from the get-go, but it was since they started to realize that this started to spread or to become more common in German couples living in the colonies, or in German people living in the colonies. That there is where the one drop rules and the different rules to avoid interracial marriage, or to prohibit, criminalize interracial marriage came up. And I guess in France the evolution might have been similar, right?
Yeah, it's a bit similar, but again, we've had some specificities, and I would like to go over them very quickly. So for the first one, we have to get back to World War One, because World War One was a huge massacre, and especially World War One. So a lot of lives were lost, and there was also a demographic deficit, because during the war, of course, there were no birth, and after, with all the men that died, there was also a small population, and demographic anxiety was already very strong in France, because it was one of the countries in Europe that had the smaller demography at this time, and during that time, because again there was this deficit, that's when I mentioned it last time, we started having European migrant wave, and it's very interesting because some of the people in the far right now have this discourse of saying, but the integration of the Spanish and Portuguese and Italians into it all fine because we're of the same European culture. And when you read the newspaper and
we're a model minority,
and discourse at the time, absolutely not. I mean, in the 2030s, it was exactly the same, that this population, they are too different from the French, they will never be able to integrate. Yes, and that was the racist discourse hasn't changed in its fundamental. It just moves to whichever wave of immigration, and so in the 2030s there was already this anxiety of the French population is going to disappear, and the specifics of French culture is going to disappear. And then moving forward to after World War II, when we started having immigration. So after World War II, there was again a need for reconstruction, and there were a lot of migrant workers, but that came this time from the French colonies, and especially from North Africa. And here there are two huge issues that are going to come. The first one is the fact that for a while a lot of the migrant workers, they did what is rather frequent. They came to France, worked for a couple of years, made some money, and then came back to their own countries. And gradually there was this notion that was peddled by part of the French political class and by part of the population that migrants in France have a vocation to live. They are not supposed to settle. But any research on migration show that yes, part of the migrants settled, come for a couple of years and then leave, but part of the migration settle. And there was always this sort of fundamental error saying that migrants should not have vocation to settle long terms, which no, it's actually some may not, but some of them do, and especially
when did you say you were leaving? Sorry, when did you say? It's been great. It's been great having you. But when did you say you were leaving our house?
So that's the first issue, and the second one is the specific issue of the war in Algeria, because. Not getting into too much detail, because again, I'm really not a specialist of this period, but the French decolonization war in current day Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and in Algeria were extremely brutal. especially the war in Algeria, complete with all the horrors that you can imagine. And it's really cemented in the far right, obviously, but also in part of the population, the idea that Arabic people and especially Islam is dangerous, is potential terrorist, because there was obviously terrorism attack from the Algerian Liberation Front. There was also terrorist groups from the French far right opposing the independence. But the violence of the war in Algeria really cemented the fear of the Arab in general. And then moving on to the 2000, the terrorist attack of 9/11, and then the 2015 terrorist attack sort of added another layer in that. And so right now the notion that all Muslims are potentially a danger, all Muslims are want to mass convert or want to take over. It's right now it's so ingrained. It's a really important to keep in mind, and it's so common and so pervasive now. It's a really disgusting at times.
I think at some point we should kind of at least talk a bit about what do we categorize under the label terrorism, right? Because it's also very convoluted. No, it's become kind of a placeholder or a bucket for anything that it's not stately sanctioned, right, or stately approved. And we're talking about a colonized region with a military regime enforcing the presence and the interest of another country that it's always first in line. So I don't know the specifics of that story, but I think it's also it's also an interesting subject to reflect on, right?
Yeah, of course. I was taking the point of view of the of the media and political discourse. Obviously, the resistance fighters against the Nazis were branded terrorism at the time. So it's a very complicated label, but part of the strategy of the independentists were to have bomb attacks and to target civilians, and this stuck. Decades after, it really remains strong, and at the same time, notoriously the French army in Algeria used torture, used summary executions, also to try to pressure the population. So independently of label, it was an absolutely disgusting conflict. The French army committed war crimes for decades. There was a huge taboo in discussing it, and obviously we're talking about a country trying to win its independence. So also the blame should not be all things equal if we want to discuss it fairly. But what I want to underline is how much the impact of the war in Algeria has permeated the general French culture
and the perception of this radical Islamism and whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when we think about Islamophobia and the perception of radical Islamism, we think about the more recent big thing, 9/11, the 2015 attacks, and they play a huge part in that. But in France, the roots go deeper.
So let's say in an English-speaking world, the evolution can be traced a bit more closely, to 9/11 and to how that has been a huge catalyst for the vilification of Islamism.
Yeah, I expect that there would also be older roots in that, but
absolutely. But
again,
before we had Russia, right? There was this evil air enemy to face, and there was this cultural construct around the USSR and around the pop culture that was very very focused on Russian, Soviet, communist communist cultures. No, not so much on races, on Islamic culture. It was kind of, this is an underdog. It's they are not powerful enough, or they're not a contestant to the game. Right?
Yeah, exactly, and connecting with the whole notion of Islamic threat. One thing I would really like to talk about is the so-called Great Replacement theory. So the Great Replacement theory, it's a conspiracy theory that states that there is an elite conspiracy to replace white population with immigrant population, and so there are variants of the theory saying that, of course, you have the anti-Semitic version, so it's orchestrated by the Jews or the Jewish conspiracy. You have the more general that the elites can prefer having a migrant population they can exploit, but the core of the Great Replacement theory is, it's again connected to the one drop rule, that there are waves of migrants coming and they are going to take over.
It is somewhat catchy, actually, because I remember very distinctly in my adolescent hearing that idea of, here in the civilized Spain, we only have one or two children most, but in third countries they're having 6, 7, 10. So at the end, they are going to be more than us, and they are going to take over, or something like that, or a version of that was something that came into my radar, at least in my adolescence.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, this notion of migration, submersion, with the idea that the white population don't have that many children, and the migrants have a lot of children. It's been there for quite a long time. Just so we're clear, it's been thoroughly debunked by demographs and statisticians, saying that. And first, to talk about a replacement, you would have to state that, again, ethnical groups are clearly separate, and we know that they mix, they evolve, so the notion of pure racial group is already bonkers. But it has been very successful lately, and thanks to...
We have Tucker Carlson really doing bank on the replacement theory, and it's...
Yes.
And it's at the core of all these terrible mass shooting massacres.
Yes,
many.
Yeah, exactly. But just so we're clear, the notion of migrant submersion is older than that, but the Great Replacement term has become very effective from a media perspective, and it was coined by a Frenchman.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the Great Replacement theory was developed in the 2010s by French author Renaud Camus, who wrote a whole book on this, and that did a lot of media appearance. And when you
Renaud Camus?
Yes.
The first Camus?
No, not the first Camus, just
no.
an homonym. And when you listen to this guy's interviews, because he does a lot of them, you realize that the reason why he started working about the Great Replacement and was just because he saw a couple of Muslim women with veil in his village in front of his very old church, and he felt like that they shouldn't be here. It was offensive to his eyes to see Muslim women in front of his lovely country village church, and he built this whole theory of the immigrants are going to replace us.
Did he use any science or any Excel sheets for that, or
no? Obviously not.
Okay.
When you listen in interviews, and because it's a conspiracy theory. So again, conspiracy theories are here to
emotionally jerk some primal fears and some very catchy. So they are very contagious, no?
Yeah.
But they are mostly emotional, and they appeal to some primal fears and instinctive elements that you know that something's wrong, and I'm gonna tell you why, and emotionally you're gonna relate to it.
Yes, exactly. And no matter how much you debunk, it's really useless, because when you again, you see it a lot in media interviews and discussion. Some people come up with numbers saying this is not true, it's just that population are mixing. But then say, oh, but people have this feeling and this and they have the feeling that they are being replaced, and if you go out in the street, you can see. So they just say, I'm seeing brown people in the street, and this is offensive, and I feel like I'm now in minority. And even if the numbers prove that it's wrong, it doesn't matter, because people feel like they are not. They have to share their space with people of color.
And their feelings are valid.
Yeah, well, it's just insane. But this insanity gets people killed, and again, let's salute this this French cultural success, because it has permeated. Now the notion of the Great Replacement is everywhere. The notion of being replaced was invoked by the protesters of the far right rally of Charlottesville in 2017, and then most notably in 2019, the Christchurch shootings in New Zealand were made in the name of the Great Replacement. It was the title of the shooter's manifesto, and he very explicitly targeted Muslim population based on this notion. So
and this started in Uvalde, Texas, a couple of days ago, and
exactly,
in a primary school shooting with more than a dozen children dead.
Yeah, so now it's and every time I read about these mass shootings, it's horrifying, because again, this notion didn't start with the term Great Replacement, because that's in the 2010s, and the notion of migration submersion is not new, but the way Renaud Camus coined the Great Replacement term and made it a conspiracy theory and stoked the fires of cultural fear, it was extremely effective, and now it's absolutely deadly, and it's horrifying.
You're welcome, listeners. We'll cut here, and we'll continue in another installment in just a minute for us, and probably a couple of days for anyone that listens closely. Thank you.
Thank you.